Okay, we are here in the final section of the book of Job, and last week we saw the Lord made an appearance and began to speak to Job from chapter 38, and the Lord appeared in a tempest or a whirlwind, and he spoke to Job about his greatness, really, and God spoke about the universe that he had created and spoke about things what today we might call geology or geography, weather systems, all of these things that God had been involved in creating, and questioning Job and Job's ability to be able to understand all of these things that God had made and God had created. And then in the second part of the speech, God spoke about the various creatures that lived on the earth and again questioned Job's understanding of that. How does Job understand nature? How does Job understand all of these creatures and how they live and how they behave and how God provides for them? And Job had responded by acknowledging his own insignificance. He spoke of himself as being of small worth and realized that there was no answer that he could give to God. He put his hand to his mouth as a sign of his silence, that he was unable to say anything in response to what God had said. So Job had admitted his ignorance of the way in which the world works, of the complexity of the world in which we live, and acknowledged that he really didn't know anything about that. Well, God hasn't finished dealing with Job. There is more for God to say, and we come to that here this evening in the Lord's second speech, recorded in chapter 40 from verse 6 through to the end of chapter 41, and then Job's response, Job's second response to the second speech there. And then finally, we have the epilogue in the final section of the book in chapter 42, verse 7 to 17, in which we see the Lord's verdict on the situation and Job's restoration. So it's an interesting final section in the book for us to look at this evening. So we're going to begin here in chapter 40 and reading from, well, the Lord's speech goes from chapter 40, verse 6 into chapter 41 and verse 34. Begin here in chapter 40. We'll read verses 6 to 14. Then the Lord replied to Job out of the tempest and said, "Gird your loins like a man. I will ask, and you will inform me. Would you impugn my justice? Would you condemn me that you may be right? Have you an arm like God's? Can you thunder with a voice like his? Deck yourself now with grandeur and eminence. Clothe yourself in glory and majesty. Scatter wide your raging anger. See every proud man and bring him low. See every proud man and humble him, and bring them down where they stand. Bury them all in the earth. Hide their faces in obscurity. Then even I would praise you for the triumph your right hand won you." The Lord's speech, second speech here, begins in the same way as the first, with a challenge for Job to prepare himself and to give an answer to God. In verse 7 there, he says, "Gird your loins like a man. I will ask, and you will inform me." And that was how the Lord had begun his first speech as well in chapter 38, verse 3. "Gird your loins like a man. I will ask, and you will inform me." So get yourself ready for what's about to come. And God says here that Job has tried to put him in the wrong in order to justify himself. There in verse 8, God asks him, "Would you impugn my justice? Would you condemn me that you may be right?" God is taking Job to task here for thinking that his own righteousness is more important than God's justice. Does Job think that he is God? If he could be God for a day, what would he do? So God invites Job to play at being God if he thinks that he can do any better. So speak like God, dress up like God, do what you think God should do. And if Job can do that, if Job could create a world where the righteous are vindicated and the wicked suffer, then in verse 14, God says that even I would praise you for the triumph your right hand won you. So God is telling Job, well, if you think you can do better, you have a go. Why don't you try being God and sort these things out? And then to illustrate just how difficult it would be for Job to do any of this, we are given a description of two monstrous creatures who are named Behemoth and Leviathan. The identity of these creatures is uncertain. The original readers, no doubt, would have known their identity and known what the Lord was talking about here. Some identify them as the hippopotamus and the crocodile. You may have a footnote in your version which identifies them as that. Although when you read the descriptions of these creatures, they don't really match what we know of as the hippopotamus and the crocodile. Some suggest that they may be dinosaurs, or another suggestion is that they are mythological creatures which represent chaos. So the chaos creatures, they cause fear and they need to be controlled. It's probably, in my personal preference, would be to go for the third there, that these are describing mythological creatures rather than any actual creatures that have existed. So we'll read here the description of Behemoth in verses 15 to 24. The Lord goes on to say this to Job: "Take now Behemoth, whom I made as I did you. He eats grass like the cattle. His strength is in his loins, his might in the muscles of his belly. He makes his tail stand up like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are like tubes of bronze, his limbs like iron rods. He is the first of God's works. Only his maker can draw the sword against him. The mountains yield him produce, where all the beasts of the field play. He lies down beneath the lotuses, in the cover of the swamp reeds. The lotuses embower him with shade, the willows of the brook surround him. He can restrain the river from its rushing. He is confident the stream will gush at his command. Can he be taken by his eyes? Can his nose be pierced by hooks?" The description of Behemoth here is given here in these verses. The word Behemoth is the plural form of the Hebrew word behemah, which is used to refer to cattle or to livestock or to beast. It's be translated in those ways. It's used in Genesis chapter 1, verse 29 of the cattle which God created on the sixth day there. So Behemoth is the plural form, and it put in the plural not to suggest that there are more than one of these creatures, but rather to emphasize that this is a great beast. So, and the description there emphasizes the power and the strength of this creature and man's inability to tame it or to control it. Speaks there of its muscles. His might is in the muscles of his belly. His tail is likened to a cedar tree. His bones are likened to tubes of bronze and limbs like iron rods. So it's an emphasis of the strength of this creature and the inability of man to be able to control it in any way. We see it's said to eat grass like the cattle, and it has strength in its loins. It's described as being amongst the lotuses, the plants sort of in the river there, in the cover of the swamp reeds. It's finding shelter and shade. It's the mountains yield him produce, so it's being provided for with these things. And then verse 24 asks, can he be taken by his eyes? Can his nose be pierced by hooks? So can you catch him? Again, the implied answer is no, no, you can't. And he's depicted as being able to restrain the river and command the stream there. So it's all to do with the strength of this creature, and this behemoth was created by God, just as Job himself had been created by God. It begins the description in verse 15 there. Take now behemoth, whom I made as I did you. So it's a creature. Again, it's showing God as the creator there, and only his maker who could defeat him. In verse 19, he is the first of God's works. Only his maker can draw the sword against him. So that's a behemoth. The second creature is Leviathan. We have the description of him in this creature in chapter 41. The Hebrew text here, the verse numbering and the chapter division is a bit different here. The Hebrew text goes from chapter 40, verse 25, to chapter 41, verse 26, but it's the same. The text is the same as chapter 41. It's just that the verse numbering and the chapter division is slightly rearranged there. So we'll read this description of Leviathan now. Can you draw out Leviathan by a fishhook? Can you press down his tongue by a rope? Can you put a ring through his nose or pierce his jaw with a barb? Will he plead with you at length? Will he speak soft words to you? Will he make an agreement with you to be taken as your lifelong slave? Will you play with him like a bird and tie him down for your girls? Shall traders traffic in him? Will he be divided up among merchants? Can you fill his skin with darts or his head with fish spears? Lay a hand on him, and you will never think of battle again. See, any hope of capturing him must be disappointed. One is prostrated by the very sight of him. There is no one so fierce as to rouse him. Who then can stand up to me? Whoever confronts me, I will requite, for everything under the heavens is mine. I will not be silent concerning him or the praise of his martial exploits. Who can uncover his outer garment? Who can penetrate the folds of his jowls? Who can pry open the doors of his face? His bared teeth strike terror. His protective scales are his pride. Locked with a binding seal, one scale touches the other. Not even a breath can enter between them. Each clings to each. They are interlocked, so they cannot be parted. His sneezings flash lightning, and his eyes are like the glimmerings of dawn. Firebrands stream from his mouth. Fiery sparks escape. Out of his nostrils comes smoke, as from a steaming, boiling cauldron. His breath ignites coals. Flames blaze from his mouth. Strength resides in his neck, power leaps before him. The layers of his flesh stick together. He is as though cast hard. He does not totter. His heart is cast hard as a stone, hard as the nether millstone. Divine beings are in dread as he rears up. As he crashes down, they cringe. No sword that overtakes him can prevail, nor spear, nor missile, nor lance. He regards iron as straw, bronze as rotted wood. No arrow can put him to flight. Sling stones turn into stubble for him. Clubs are regarded as stubble. He scoffs at the quivering javelin. His underpart is jagged shards. It spreads a threshing sledge on the mud. He makes the depths seethe like a cauldron. He makes the sea boil like an ointment pot. His wake is a luminous path. He makes the deep seem white-haired. There is no one on land who can dominate him, made as he is without fear. He sees all that is haughty. He is king over all proud beasts. So we have a much longer, more detailed description here of the second creature, Leviathan. Leviathan has already been mentioned in the book back in chapter 3 and verse 8. Which was the first of Job's speeches here, near the beginning of Job's first speech. He says, may those who cast spells upon the day damn it, those prepared to disable Leviathan, may its twilight stars remain dark, may it hope for light in heaven. It's talking about the day of his birth. Job, this, if you remember, was Job regretting the day of his birth, regretting that he had been born, and Leviathan being mentioned there in connection with that. Leviathan also mentioned in Psalms, a couple of the Psalms here. Psalm 74, verse 14. It was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan, who left him as food for the denizens of the desert. Speaking of God's power over Leviathan, then referring to Leviathan as being a many-headed creature, that you crushed the heads of Leviathan. And then also in Psalm 104, verse 26. There go the ships and Leviathan that you formed to sport with. This is the psalmist describing the creation and particularly looking there at the sea there with the various creatures of the sea, the living things small and great, and he sees the ships and Leviathan mentioned there, this sea creature, this sea monster, which God formed to sport in the sea. And then in Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, chapter 27 and verse 1. In that day the Lord will punish with his great, cruel, mighty sword Leviathan, the elusive serpent, Leviathan, the twisting serpent. He will slay the dragon of the sea. So Leviathan associated with the sea there as well, and described as being like the serpent, the elusive serpent, the twisting serpent. Again, it emphasizes God's power, God's control over this creature, Leviathan. In this description that the Lord gives to Job here, it's emphasizing the terrifying power of this creature, the description given of its skin, and that it cannot be subdued or controlled by man, that there are no weapons that can penetrate its skin, no arrows or spears or anything like that can get into its skin. And the description of it being like these layers of skin that form this strong shell around the creature, a bit like we can understand why people would think it would be a crocodile because of the description that is given here, of particularly of its tough skin. So the question is then, well, if man cannot control such a creature as this, then how can man confront or control the Lord Yahweh, who is so much greater than this? So a couple of quotes here from some of the commentators on this. This one is from, the first one here is from David Atkinson in his commentary, The Message of Job. He says, taken together then, Behemoth and Leviathan could stand for the apex of natural and supernatural strength. They embody the inexplicable and the frightening in God's world. So he's saying that they represent that which is beyond our understanding, the unexplainable and the frightening aspects of God's world. So these two creatures are beyond human control and understanding, but they're under the control of God there. In chapter 41, there, verses 10 and 11, Leviathan, the Lord says, no one is so fierce that he dares to stir him up. Who then is he that can stand before me? The God drawing that comparison. You can't stir up Leviathan. Who then can? You can't. If you can't control Leviathan, why do you think that you can control me? Who then is it that can stand before me? And then in verse 11, who has given to me that I should repay him? Whatever is under the whole heaven is mine. So God again asserting his authority, his sovereignty over everything there. And the second quotation I have here is from John Walton's commentary, and his view is that Behemoth represents Job and Leviathan represents Yahweh. And he says Yahweh's message would be clear. Job, be strong and content like Behemoth, and don't think that you can domesticate or subdue me any more than you can Leviathan. Job needs to have more respect for Yahweh. So on that view, it's an interesting view that Behemoth represents Job in a condition of contentment, strength. The things that are said of Behemoth there would apply to Job, but then Leviathan applying to the Lord, that you can't domesticate or subdue me any more than you can Leviathan. So we then have Job's response to this in chapter 42, verses 1 to 6. Job said in reply to the Lord, I know that you can do everything, that nothing you propose is impossible for you. Who is this who obscures counsel without knowledge? Indeed, I spoke without understanding of things beyond me, which I did not know. Hear now, and I will speak. I will ask, and you will inform me. I had heard you with my ears, but now I see you with my eyes. Therefore I recant and relent, being but dust and ashes. Job responds to God now with an expression of humility and submission. It's different to his response after the first speech, in which, in effect, he had been silenced. He had nothing to say. But here he responds with humility and with submission. And Job has now come to recognize the power and the wisdom of God, that God can do everything and nothing is impossible for him. Job acknowledges his own inability to understand God's ways and admits that he had spoken of things which were beyond his comprehension, things which were too wonderful to know. In verse 5 there, Job makes the distinction between things that he had heard with his ears, sort of second-hand experiences, and things he has now seen with his eyes, first-hand experiences. So he's been given more understanding, more knowledge about God. There were things that he'd heard, but now he's actually seen some things for himself. And then, considering all of this, then Job despised himself and repented in dust and ashes in verse 6. So he realizes that he was wrong in trying to challenge God's ways, and he now wishes to recant or to withdraw his arguments. The case that he had been presenting throughout the book, he wants to take all of that back. This is not repentance in the sense of acknowledging sin and changing behavior, but rather it's an expression of his regret over the things that he had previously said and thought about God. And the dust and the ashes is not an expression of his repentance, but an acknowledgement of the human condition. One suggested translation of verse 6 is that it should be rendered as, therefore I am disgusted and take pity on wretched humanity. The idea that he now understands the human condition much better. So the Lord's speech, the combination of both of the speeches, I think, has this effect of strengthening Job's faith and his trust in God. Now at the end, he feels that he knows God better than he did before. Not that he has been provided with an answer or an explanation of his suffering and his predicament. He's never told that. But he now realizes that what he needs to do is place his trust in the wisdom of a God who is so much greater than him. But we come then to the final part of the book, what we call the epilogue, where we have the Lord's verdict and Job's restoration in chapter 42 from verse 7 through to the end at verse 17. Like the opening two chapters, the epilogue is written in a prose style rather than poetry. From chapter 3 through to chapter 41 and the first 6 verses of chapter 42, it's been all poetry. But now we go back to the prose style where we began the book. So it begins and ends with this change of style in the writing here. So verses 7 to 9, he says this: After the Lord had spoken these words to Job, the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, I am incensed at you and your two friends, for you have not spoken the truth about me, as did my servant Job. Now take 7 bulls and 7 rams, and go to my servant Job, and sacrifice a burnt offering for yourselves. And let Job, my servant, pray for you. For to him I will show favor, and not treat you vilely, since you have not spoken the truth about me, as did my servant Job. Eliphaz the Temanite, and Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite went and did as the Lord had told them, and the Lord showed favor to Job. So God's wrath is kindled against Eliphaz and his two friends, Bildad and Zophar, because they had not spoken the truth about God as his servant Job had. The three friends had presented a false view of God and of how God operates. And although Job has also spoken some things about God which were not right, inappropriate, compared to his friends, his words and his conclusions were more accurate and more valid. And so the friends are instructed to take 7 bulls and 7 rams to Job to offer them up as a burnt offering, and Job is to pray for them so that they may avoid experiencing anything similar to what Job had experienced himself. The Lord says to him, that's to Job, I will show favor and not treat you vilely. So God will be showing favor towards Job by not mistreating the three friends here. Job himself is to act as a sort of intercessor, and God will accept Job's prayer for them. So Job is to pray on their behalf to God, and God will accept Job's prayer. So Job finds himself playing the role that he had wanted someone to play that role for himself in his relationship with God, that he wanted someone to intervene, and now Job finds himself having to do that here for his friends. We come then verses 10 to 17 and the restoration of Job. The Lord restored Job's fortunes when he prayed on behalf of his friends, and the Lord gave Job twice what he had before. All his brothers and sisters and all his former friends came to him and had a meal with him in his house. They consoled and comforted him for all the misfortune that the Lord had brought upon him. Each gave him 1 kesitah, and each one gold ring. Thus the Lord blessed the latter years of Job's life more than the former. He had 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, 1,000 yoke of oxen, and 1,000 she-asses. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters. The first he named Jemimah, the second Keziah, and the third Kerin Happuch. Nowhere in the land were women as beautiful as Job's daughters to be found. Their father gave them estates together with their brothers. Afterward, Job lived 140 years to see 4 generations of sons and grandsons. Job died old and contented. Job's fortune then was restored to him when he prayed for his friends, and God gave him twice as much as he had before. His brothers and sisters and former friends now came and ate with him in his house. So he's back in his house. He's not sitting on the rubbish tip of the town's rubbish tip amongst the ashes, but he's back in his house. And they showed him sympathy and comforted him. We may wonder, well, where were they earlier? Why weren't they there before? But here they are anyway, and they come to sympathize with him, comfort him, and they give him money and a gold ring. And the Lord blessed his latter years more than his former years. The numbers of Job's animals given in verse 12 there are double the numbers that he lost back in chapter 1. He also had 7 sons and 3 daughters again. Again, at the beginning, he had 7 sons and 3 daughters who were killed when the whirlwind came and destroyed the house where they were gathered together. So he has these 7 more sons and 3 more daughters as well. Perhaps that would ease the grief over the loss of his first sons and daughters as well. His 3 daughters are named. The sons aren't named, but the 3 daughters are named, and they're described as being the most beautiful women in the land. And they, along with their brothers, are given estates by Job. And that's perhaps a notable point as well, that as women, they are given property here. And the book concludes with Job living for a further 140 years. We don't know how old he was at this point, but he lives for a further 140 years, seeing 4 generations of sons and grandsons. And he died, we're told, old and contented. And the description of his death there is similar to the ones we find in the book of Genesis of some of the characters there of Abraham. In Genesis chapter 25, verse 8, says of Abraham's death, Abraham breathed his last and died in good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. And then Isaac as well in Genesis chapter 35 and verse 29. And Isaac breathed his last, and he died and was gathered to his people, old and full of days, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. So a similar description here given of Job, that Job died old and contented. The restoration of Job's wealth should not be seen as a reward for his righteousness. That would undermine the whole purpose of the book if that were the case. The idea that the righteous are rewarded with prosperity whilst the wicked suffer was the view of Job's 3 friends, and God has disproved that theory. Job had been tested, and the test proved that Job did not serve God simply for what he could get out of it, as the adversary at the beginning of the book had accused Job of doing. Job demonstrated that the adversary was wrong, and people can live righteous lives simply because that is the right thing to do, and not with the expectation of any kind of reward. And throughout all of his speeches, Job never asked for material wealth to be restored to him. All he wanted was vindication, to be shown, for it to be confirmed that he was innocent. So Job had passed the test, and now God restored his fortune and blessed him. And by doing this, God shows that he will continue to act in the way that he has acted before. And people will be blessed simply because God delights in blessing people. And so, in a sense, we may say that normal service is resumed. I just want to conclude here with another quote, and again this comes from one of the commentaries, John Walton's commentary, and he says this: in order to understand the strategy and import of the book, we must recognize that it does not offer us an explanation of why righteous people suffer. We should not base our expectations on Job's experiences. Job receives no explanation for his suffering, and the book does not fill that void for readers either. The only explanation the book offers concerns right thinking about God and his policies in a world where suffering is pervasive and inevitable. In light of the preceding points, the epilogue is the perfect conclusion to the book. The challenges to God's policies have been addressed, and various misconceptions about God and the cosmos have been dispelled. In the process, we have gained wisdom. This wisdom does not ease our suffering, but it does help us to avoid the foolish thinking that might lead us to reject God when we need him most. And that brings our study of the text